Chapter 1. The Fete at Hazelworth. The Hazelworth summer fete was the kind of event that belonged to another age. The bunting hung gaily between the elms on the village green. The band of the local school puffed their way through Rule Britannia, and the Women's Institute stall groaned under the weight of cakes, scones and jams of every conceivable hue. It was a perfect June afternoon. Children darted between stalls, dogs barked cheerfully, and the vicar's wife fluttered about, ensuring the judges were suitably refreshed with lemonade. To the casual eye, Hazelworth was the picture of rural contentment. Miss Jane Marple, however, knew that such scenes were never so simple. She had come at the invitation of her old friend Mrs. Weatherby, who lived nearby. Seated beneath a striped umbrella, her knitting in her lap, she observed the ebb and flow of the villagers with her usual mild smile and penetrating eyes. At the centre of much attention stood the Women's Institute jam competition. Rows of gleaming jars caught the sunlight. Strawberry, raspberry, damson, and gooseberry, each neatly labelled in tidy handwriting. A faint perfume of sugar and fruit filled the air. "Old Mr. Enderby is judging again," Mrs. Weatherby whispered to Miss Marple. "Fancies himself quite the expert on preserves. Heaven help anyone whose set isn't firm enough." Indeed, Mr. Percival Enderby was making his way along the table with solemn gravity, spoon in hand, pausing to sample and pronounce upon each entry. A retired magistrate with a sharp tongue, he relished his role as arbiter of Hazelworth's domestic prowess. The competitors, mostly village women, but a few men too, watched him with thinly disguised anxiety. Mrs. Pritchard pursed her lips as he frowned at her rhubarb and ginger. Miss Dawes held her breath as he nodded approvingly over her strawberry. And Miss Martha Finch, the reigning champion, stood serene. Her entry, a deep, ruby-red jar, waiting at the far end. It was when Mr. Enderby dipped his spoon into Miss Finch's jar that the day changed forever. He took a hearty mouthful, smacked his lips and began to pronounce his judgment, but the words never came. Instead, his face contorted oddly. He coughed once, twice, then staggered backward, the spoon clattering to the grass. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone cried out. Mr. Enderby's hands clawed at his throat, his eyes bulging, and then, with a dreadful suddenness, he collapsed across the table, sending jars tumbling and smashing to the ground. Sticky jam spread across the grass like spilled blood. Dr. Haydock, summoned in haste from the refreshment tent, bent over him. Within moments he straightened, his expression grave. "He's gone," he said quietly. The fete dissolved into confusion. Mrs. Pritchard screamed. Miss Finch fainted dead away. The vicar wrung his hands. Children were hustled away from the dreadful sight, though not before several had peered with fascinated horror at the fallen judge. And, through it all, Miss Marple sat very still, her knitting fallen into her lap, her blue eyes calm but searching. She had noticed the exact jar from which Mr. Enderby had taken his fatal spoonful. She had seen the faint tremor in Miss Finch's hand as she stood behind him. She had even noted the peculiar neatness of the label affixed to the jar. "Poison," murmured Mrs. Weatherby in hushed tones. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Yes, my dear, a deadly thing indeed, and placed most cleverly in the most ordinary of disguises," she sighed softly. "One must never underestimate the power of a jam jar." Chapter 2. Sticky Suspicions. By the next morning, the shocking scene at the fete was the only subject on every lip in Hazelworth. At the post office, in the baker's shop, and along the hedgerows where neighbours paused with baskets in hand, the talk flowed faster than the summer brook. Poison. "That's what it was," declared Mrs. Pritchard, her voice full of relish. "I said at once it couldn't have been natural. A man doesn't turn purple and drop like that unless he's had something." Miss Dawes, clutching her shopping bag, nodded vigorously. "And after tasting Martha Finch's jam, too. Mark my words, she'll never hold her head up again.
But Martha has won 3 years running, Mrs. Perkins, the postmistress countered.
Why would she risk her reputation now? No, if you ask me, someone tampered with her jar. Jealousy, that's what it is. All these women competing year after year. It's bound to breed bad feeling. From the shadows of the shop, Mr. Carter, the grocer, muttered, or perhaps someone had a quarrel with Enderby himself. He was fond of throwing his weight about in the parish council. I dare say more than one person would like to see him silenced. Meanwhile, Inspector Graves had taken charge of the investigation, his broad figure striding across the village green like a man who already knew the answer. He ordered the jars collected and sent to the laboratory in the market town, and he interviewed Miss Finch at length. She seemed nervous, he confided to Dr. Haydock over a hastily taken cup of tea. Wouldn't look me in the eye, and she had opportunity. The jar came straight from her pantry. No sign of tampering, the doctor frowned. Nerves don't make a murderer. Martha may be a proud woman, but she isn't cruel.
I'd look elsewhere if I were you, Inspector Graves sniffed.
That, doctor, is precisely why you're not me. Miss Marple, for her part, listened politely to the villagers' whispers, but offered no opinions. Seated by the vicarage window with her knitting, she simply asked the sort of mild questions that seemed no more than curiosity. Was Mr. Enderby well liked, do you think? Had anyone quarrelled with Miss Finch of late? Who, I wonder, was near the jam table just before the judging began? It was remarkable how much people would tell her, simply to fill the silence. She learned that Mr. Enderby had recently blocked a proposal for new allotments, angering several villagers. She learned that Miss Dawes had once accused Miss Finch of stealing her recipe for plum jam. And she learned, most interestingly, that the jars had been left unattended for some minutes while the band struck up a march. That evening, as she took tea with Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple reflected aloud. It is curious, is it not, how very dangerous our everyday comforts may be. One thinks of jam as something sweet, safe, and homely, yet it made the perfect hiding place. Everyone saw the jar, admired it, even tasted from it, but no one thought it might carry death. Mrs. Weatherby shuddered. But who, Jane, who could have done such a dreadful thing? Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles clicking once more.
Oh, my dear, that is what we must find out.
And if one considers human nature, I think the answer will not be far away, for it is not jam itself that is deadly, but the pride, the jealousy, and the fear that so often cling to it. Chapter 3. The wrong suspect Inspector Graves wasted little time. By the following day, the village learned that Miss Martha Finch, 3-time champion of the jam competition,
Had been formally arrested. The
announcement caused a sensation. Mrs. Pritchard declared she had always said there was something sly about Martha's eyes. Miss Dawes clucked her tongue and hinted that Miss Finch's late father
had been not entirely honest with money, and Mrs. Perkins at the post office swore.
She had seen Martha slipping into the village hall the night before the fete, up to no good.
You may be sure. It all seemed very neat.
Too neat, thought Miss Marple. The inspector, speaking to the vicar in confident tones, explained his reasoning. The poisoned jam came directly from her pantry. She alone had custody of it. The laboratory confirms it contained oxalic acid, readily obtained and quite sufficient to kill a man. There's your case, tidy as a Sunday roast. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quietly by with her knitting, looked up with mild interest. And yet, Inspector, one must ask why Miss Finch would risk so much.
Pride in her preserves, yes, but murder at a public fete under so many eyes?
That is rather like pruning a rosebush with an axe, is it not? Graves frowned. She had motive. Enderby insulted her last year in front of half the village, said her strawberry set was as runny as cough syrup. A proud woman might not forget such humiliation. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly.
Ah, yes.
But humiliation often leads to spiteful remarks, not always to careful poisoning. That afternoon, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to Miss Finch's cottage. It was a tidy place, shelves lined with gleaming jars, each labelled in the same firm hand. Yet one jar space stood empty. "Taken by the police," Martha said bitterly, her eyes red from weeping. "They'll never believe me innocent, Miss Marple. But I didn't poison him.
I only wanted to win fairly, as I always have."
Someone has done this to ruin me." Miss Marple touched her hand kindly. "The truth, my dear, is rather like good jam. It takes patience, but it sets firm in the end." Her eyes moved to the pantry shelf. There was a faint smear of sugar on the wood, and, curiously, a jar pushed slightly back as if replaced in haste. The label on that jar was not quite straight. Later, over supper with Mrs. Weatherby, Miss Marple shared her thoughts. "There are 3 small things, my dear. First, the inspector claims the jar came untouched from Martha's pantry, yet there is one upon her shelf that bears the marks of hurried replacement. Second, oxalic acid is not commonly to hand in a kitchen, but it is in certain garden sheds. And third, Mr. Enderby was a man who meddled not only in recipes but in other people's affairs."
"That is often far more dangerous."
Mrs. Weatherby looked startled. "You mean the wrong person is under suspicion?" Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "I mean only this: human nature will tell us the truth if we listen. And at present, the truth is whispering that Martha Finch did not kill Mr. Enderby." Chapter 4. Whispers and Weeds. With Miss Finch locked away in the market town jail, Hazelworth might have settled, but villages never settle while there is gossip to be had. And in Hazelworth, gossip grew like nettles in a neglected hedge. At the Blue Boar tea room, Mrs. Pritchard leaned across the table with relish. They say Martha kept her preserves under lock and key today, as though she knew there was something odd about that jar.
"Guilty conscience, if you ask me," but Mrs. Dawes sniffed. "Conscience? Rubbish."
What about Enderby's quarrel with the allotment holders? Half the men in Hazelworth wanted him out of the way. Why, he accused Tom Bristow of stealing gooseberries. Miss Perkins, ever eager to contribute, added, "And don't forget the matter of Mrs. Enderby's legacy. I've heard her brother was furious that Percival got the lion's share."
"People don't die for jam, my dears, but they might for money." So it went on. Rivalries, resentments.
Small injuries magnified by repetition until they sounded like murder motives. Miss Marple, sipping tea in her usual quiet manner, listened without interruption. Gossip, she knew, was like the bramble, thorny, sprawling, and apt to hide the real fruit beneath. That afternoon she took a slow walk through Hazelworth, stopping to greet villagers and admire gardens. At Mr. Bristow's gate she paused to note the shed door, poorly latched. Inside she glimpsed a tin marked oxalic acid, just the thing for cleaning rust from tools. It was nothing unusual, but she stored it quietly in her mind. At the grocer's she overheard a muttered quarrel between young Alice Turner and her employer, Mr. Carter. Alice's face was pale, her eyes full of tears.
"I didn't do anything wrong," she insisted. Mr. Carter only frowned and shook his head. And in the lane near the church,
she encountered Mrs. Dawes, who blurted out nervously, "If you ask me, it was meant for someone else. Enderby always poked his nose in where it wasn't wanted."
"Perhaps he ate what was never meant for him." Miss Marple smiled her gentle smile.
"Yes, my dear.
Accidents of that kind do happen."
Though one must ask, who was truly expected to taste from that jar? That evening, sitting in Mrs. Weatherby's parlour with her knitting, Miss Marple reflected. It is like a garden, you see. A weed here, a bramble there. Each villager's tale has its thorn. But when one clears the tangle, what remains is most instructive. There is jealousy among the jam makers, yes. But there is also money, inheritance, and resentment over power in the village. Enderby made himself disliked by many, Mrs. Weatherby shivered. Then any of them might have killed him. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Precisely. But only one of them thought to use a jam jar, and that tells us a great deal about their habits. She bent her head over her knitting. The inspector thinks it is all neat and tidy, but gardens and crimes alike are seldom. Chapter 5. The Second Spoonful. The village had just begun to grow accustomed to the idea of Miss Finch as a murderess when the second shock struck Hazelworth. It happened on a damp Thursday morning at the Blue Boar tea room. Several ladies of the Women's Institute were gathered, cups of tea steaming before them, when Mrs. Dawes, a stout woman with a sweet tooth, helped herself generously to the pot of strawberry jam set upon the table. She spread it thickly on her scone, took a satisfied bite, and within minutes turned pale, clutching at her throat. There was a commotion, chairs scraping, cries for water, Mrs. Dawes gasping. By good fortune, Dr. Pembroke was present and forced an emetic.
After some harrowing moments, the danger passed.
She was carried home, weak but alive, and the jam pot, half empty, sat upon the table, its contents quickly sealed away by Inspector Graves, who had arrived in high alarm. "This proves it," the inspector exclaimed later at the inn. "Another jar from Martha Finch's pantry, no doubt about it. She's tried again and failed only by luck." Miss Marple looked mildly over her spectacles. "But, Inspector, if Miss Finch is locked away in jail, how could she possibly have contrived this?" Graves flushed. "She might have accomplices."
"A niece, a friend?"
"Criminals often do." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. "Or perhaps, Inspector, she has been made the scapegoat for someone else's mischief. It is curious, is it not, that the jam appeared here in the Blue Boar tea room, a place quite beyond Miss Finch's reach?" Later that day, Miss Marple called upon Mrs. Dawes, who lay propped up in bed with an air of great importance. It was terrible, Miss Marple, quite terrible. But I felt it at once. That peculiar tang, not strawberry at all.
I said to myself, "This jam is touched by evil." Miss Marple patted her hand.
"You are quite right, dear. Evil is often most noticeable when it disguises itself in something sweet." She noticed, too, on the bedside table, a small packet of bills and a letter half tucked beneath them. Mrs. Dawes flushed when she saw Miss Marple's eyes stray there and quickly pushed them aside. That evening, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Weatherby and considered the pattern. It is the second spoonful, my dear, that tells the tale. If poor Mr. Enderby was the intended victim, why strike again? But if he was only the unfortunate taster of a poison meant for another, then matters become quite different. The second attempt shows the hand of a poisoner growing desperate. Mrs. Weatherby looked troubled. "But who could it be meant for?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That, my dear, is the question. We must ask who gains by these deaths, not who loses face at a village competition. And already I fancy I have seen something that others have overlooked." Chapter 6. Seeds of Suspicion. The second attempt at poisoning set Hazelworth buzzing like a disturbed hive. At the post office, Mrs. Perkins declared that she would never again eat jam unless she had boiled and bottled it herself. At the butcher's, old Mr. Higgins muttered darkly that the whole lot of the Women's Institute are vipers. And at the Blue Boar, speculation flew thicker than the steam from the teapots, but among the swirl of tales, 3 names recurred with troubling regularity. Tom Bristow, the gardener, who was said to owe Mr. Enderby money for seed and tools. Alice Turner, the grocer's assistant, who had quarrelled with her employer and was seen in tears the very day before the first poisoning. Mrs. Dawes herself, who some whispered had staged her attack for attention. Miss Marple, walking quietly through the village with her basket, paused to notice things others dismissed. At the allotments, she bent to examine a heap of discarded papers and noted one curious scrap, the edge of a label torn from a jam jar. The neat copperplate hand was not Martha Finch's cramped scrawl, but a more flowing, elegant script. Miss Marple slipped it into her knitting bag. At the grocer's, Alice Turner served her shyly. "Only 1 pound of sugar left, Miss Marple."
"There's been such a run on it." Her hands trembled.
And Miss Marple noticed faint reddish stains on her cuff. Currants, perhaps, or ink. Later that afternoon she called upon Clara Dawes, who, despite her recent ordeal, could not resist the thrill of being the centre of the village's concern. "I tell you, Miss Marple, if Enderby hadn't been so miserly with his judgments, none of this would have happened."
He set half the parish against the other half.
That evening, by her parlour fire, Miss Marple reviewed the tangle of threads. "Seeds of suspicion are like weeds," she murmured to herself, "blown about and sprouting everywhere. But weeds also show where the soil has been disturbed." She took out the torn jam label and studied it in the lamplight. Someone had prepared that jar deliberately, with handwriting carefully disguised, but not carefully enough. A clue lay hidden in the slant of the letters. Her needles clicked steadily as she thought on. "It is not the jam itself that matters, nor even the death of Mr. Enderby, poor man. It is what the jam conceals, a secret, a quarrel, a debt unpaid. The poison was not random but chosen, and the hand that poured it is closer to home than anyone suspects." Chapter 7. The Poisoner's Hand. The morning after her discovery, Miss Marple sat serenely in the corner of the Blue Boar tea-room, her knitting on her lap and the torn jam label tucked into her reticule. From her quiet seat, she watched the comings and goings of the village, noting how people carried themselves when they believed no one observed. "The gossip turns, missus." Perkins bustled in, breathless with news.
They say Alice Turner has been seen purchasing arsenic weed killer from Mr. Wainwright. Clear as day that girl's got a hand in it. Inspector Graves, overhearing, stiffened.
"A dangerous piece of evidence, Mrs. Perkins. I'll be calling on her directly." Miss Marple coughed gently. "Arsenic, yes, but many a young housekeeper uses it for ant traps in the pantry, Inspector. We mustn't leap to conclusions. The handwriting, for instance, is far more telling than purchases at the grocer's." A visit to the rectory. Later, Miss Marple called upon the Reverend Hughes, ostensibly to deliver a jar of marmalade. When he signed his name in the parish book, she discreetly compared the letters to her fragment. Too upright, too precise. Not the hand she sought, but when Mrs. Dawes popped in, chattering about her miraculous recovery, Miss Marple noticed her shopping list scrawled hastily on the back of an envelope. The same flourish on the Y as in the jam label. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though she said nothing. The inspector's frustration. Inspector Graves stormed into the Finch cottage that evening, determined to prove Martha guilty despite her imprisonment. He laid the second jam jar before her.
"Admit it, you prepared more than one poison jar."
Martha looked bewildered. "But, Inspector, I've never in my life written labels in that hand."
"Everyone knows I can hardly manage my own grocery list." From the shadows, Miss Marple's voice was gentle.
"Quite so. In fact, Inspector, the penmanship belongs to someone else entirely. Someone who wished to frame Miss Finch and who grew careless when preparing a second batch." Quiet conclusions. That night, back in her parlour, Miss Marple folded away the label. The poisoner's hand is revealed not in great gestures, but in the small stroke of a pen. And once one knows where to look, the motive is as plain as the nose on Mrs. Dawes's face. Her needles clicked in steady rhythm. Poor Mr. Enderby was merely in the way. The true quarrel lies elsewhere, in money owed, in pride, wounded, in secrets hidden. And now I think our poisoner grows desperate enough to strike again. Chapter 8. The Third Spoonful. The village awoke to another shock. At Mrs. Weatherby's afternoon tea, a guest, young Alice Turner, the grocer's assistant, had collapsed after tasting a spoonful of jam served on a scone. Though the doctor assured everyone the dose was not fatal, the message was clear. The poisoner still walked among them. Panic in Hazelworth. The women of the Women's Institute were in uproar. "First Enderby, then poor Mrs. Dawes, and now Alice," cried Mrs. Perkins. "This village will be the death of us all." Inspector Graves, his patience fraying, turned once more to his favoured suspect. It all circles back to Martha Finch. Her preserves, her methods, her kitchen, everything points to her. Miss Marple who had been quietly spreading clotted cream on her own scone, shook her head. "No, Inspector. You are chasing the shadow, not the substance. The poisoner's hand is elsewhere, and becoming more reckless." The telltale jam pot that evening, Miss Marple called at the vicarage where the tainted jam pot had been taken for safekeeping. She examined it by lamplight, running a finger lightly over the paper label. "This hand," she murmured. "The loop of the R, the flourish of the I." "Yes, the same as before," she smiled faintly. "And how curious that the jar should be from a batch Martha never even entered in the fate." A visit to Mrs. Dawes, Miss Marple next visited Clara Dawes, who received her with exaggerated sympathy.
Poor Alice, what a dreadful business.
"But surely, Miss Marple, this proves it was Martha all along." Jane's blue eyes twinkled.
On the contrary, my dear.
"What it proves is that our poisoner, having failed twice, grows clumsy, and clumsiness, Mrs. Dawes, betrays more than cunning ever can." As she left, Miss Marple noticed the wastebasket in the hall. Inside was a crumpled envelope, the hand identical to the jam labels. Quiet deduction, that night by her fire, Miss Marple considered all. Mr. Enderby judged too harshly. Mrs. Dawes feared humiliation, even ruin, if her secrets became known. What better way to silence him, and then to cast suspicion on poor Martha Finch? But vanity and spite are careless allies. Each jar, each label, is a signature she cannot disguise. She laid down her knitting. "Tomorrow, I think, the truth must be spoken plainly. Our poisoner has dipped her spoon 3 times. There will not be a 4th. Chapter 9. The Final Taste. The village hall of Hazelworth had seldom been so crowded. Inspector Graves had insisted on assembling everyone connected to the fete. The long table was spread with the remaining jars of jam, their bright labels cheerful against the sombre mood. Miss Marple, seated primly near the end, clicked her knitting needles. She had asked for this gathering. "There is only one way to put an end to the matter," she had told the inspector. "Let the poisoner be confronted in the place where it all began." The inspector's theory. Graves cleared his throat. "The evidence is plain. The poison jar bore Martha Finch's mark. The later attempts, too, stemmed from her pantry."
I see no need for further delay. There was a murmur of agreement until Miss Marple raised her voice gently. "Oh, Inspector, you're too tidy."
"Life rarely presents such neat parcels. No, the hand that poisoned Mr. Enderby was not Miss Finch's, the label's secret." She lifted a jar, holding it to the light.
"Do you see this label?"
"The loop of the R, the flourish of the I. It is the same on every tainted pot. Miss Finch's handwriting, however, is stiff, upright, almost childlike. Quite different. Someone else prepared these." A stir ran through the room. Mrs. Dawes turned pale. The motive uncovered. Miss Marple's voice was calm, almost sorrowful. "Mr. Enderby threatened to expose a matter from years ago, a debt, and a little dishonesty at the Women's Institute accounts. Small perhaps, but to a lady of pride, ruinous. Mrs. Dawes, you silenced him with a spoonful of jam, and you sought to cast blame on poor Martha." Mrs. Dawes gasped.
"That's a lie."
But Miss Marple continued, her tone gentle but firm.
Your own shopping lists gave you away.
The same looping hand, the same flourish. You grew careless when you prepared more jars to support your deception. Alice Turner's collapse was your final attempt, and your undoing. Confession misses." Dawes faltered, her hands trembling.
"He would have destroyed me. All my standing in the village."
"I only wish to stop his tongue." Inspector Graves moved swiftly to her side. "You'll have plenty of time to explain that to the magistrates." Miss Marple reflects as the villagers dispersed in shocked silence. Miss Marple gathered her knitting. "It is ever the same," she murmured to Mrs. Weatherby. "One need not look to hatred or greed. Pride and the fear of scandal are quite sufficient to turn a spoonful of jam into a weapon." Her needles clicked once more as she left the hall, her step unhurried. "And that," she said softly, "is the final taste." Chapter 10 echoes in Hazelworth. The weeks after Mrs. Dawes's arrest passed in a curious mixture of relief and unease. The Women's Institute resumed its meetings, though Jam was pointedly absent from the refreshment table. The Blue Boar tea room, once the hub of gossip, grew subdued, as though villagers feared their words might curdle into poison if spoken too freely. Gossip rewritten, as always in an English village, the story began to change almost at once, Mrs. Dawes. "Why, I always thought her too smooth by half," declared Mrs. Perkins. I said,
"Years ago that her raspberry conserve was unnatural," added Mr. Latham.
The grocer, though no one recalled him saying any such thing, and so the tale reshaped itself. Hints, half-memories, and invented warnings that had never been uttered before, now polished as proof that the villagers had always suspected. Martha Finch restored. Miss Martha Finch, released from suspicion, returned to her cottage with head held high. She accepted her reinstatement with the WI committee gracefully, though she never again entered the jam competition. "The whole business has left a sour taste," she remarked dryly to Miss Marple, who smiled kindly and offered her tea. Miss Marple's reflection, on a gentle evening in September. Miss Marple sat by her garden window, the scent of late roses drifting in. She spoke quietly to Mrs. Weatherby, who had come for tea. "You see, dear, it is never only hatred or greed.
Vanity, resentment, the fear of disgrace. Such tiny seeds, and yet they grow into dreadful thorns."
And people will dress them up in the sweetest jars and prettiest labels. Mrs. Weatherby sighed. "Do you think we shall ever be free of such things, Jane?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "No, my dear. Human nature is much like jam. However sweet it appears, it always holds what has been boiled into it. One must only learn to taste carefully." Closing note that night, as church bells tolled across Hazelworth, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and gazed at the peaceful village street. Lights twinkled in cottage windows, laughter drifted faintly on the air, and yet she knew, beneath every ordinary pattern lay darker threads. She smiled, calm and watchful, for in the quiet lanes of England there would always be another mystery, and another Miss Marple to see it for what it was. Chapter 11. The Village Resumes. Though Hazelworth had endured the sting of scandal, the rhythm of village life could not be long disrupted. Autumn pressed its hand upon the hedgerows, and the air smelled of apples and wood smoke rather than strawberries and sugar. Yet, wherever Miss Marple walked, she felt the lingering unease that follows in the wake of a crime. The Blue Boar's return at the Blue Boar tea room, chatter began to recover its old sparkle, though the patrons could not help weaving the jam jar into every conversation. "Poison,"
"In something so homely," whispered Mrs. Perkins. "Ah."
"But it was pride that soured the pot," replied Mrs. Carmody sagely. Jam was served again, cautiously, and customers eyed each spoonful with ironic suspicion, before laughing at their own nerves. The WI meeting, the Women's Institute, once shaken to its core, carried on. A new competition was arranged, not for jam this time, but for embroidery. "Needles are safer than spoons," quipped one of the younger members, though Miss Marple noticed how uneasily several ladies laughed. Martha Finch sat quietly, her dignity intact, while others sought to overpraise her preserves, as though to erase their earlier doubt. Miss Marple and the vicar one evening, Miss Marple took tea with the vicar's wife, who sighed as she poured. "It is dreadful to think such wickedness might lurk in a place as gentle as Hazelworth." Miss Marple's reply was soft but firm. "My dear, wickedness does not come from place but from people."
"Villages, like jam jars, preserve all manner of things, sweetness, bitterness, and sometimes a touch of poison."
"One mustn't be deceived by the label." The last word. By the time Michaelmas arrived, Mrs. Dawes had faded into memory, spoken of only in cautious tones. New scandals and small triumphs soon claimed Hazelworth's attention. A scandal about hens trespassing, a choir solo gone awry, the perennial rivalry of gardens. Yet, for Miss Marple, the sight of any neatly labelled jar on a pantry shelf now carried with it a reminder that even in the most ordinary vessel, danger may quietly wait, and so she returned to her knitting, her gentle smile concealing the watchful eyes that saw so very much. Chapter 12. The Last Spoonful. The first frost had touched the gardens of Hazelworth. Leaves fell in quiet drifts, and the summer fete with its bright banners and bustling stalls seemed now a dream of another season. The jam jars that had once glittered with pride on the Women's Institute table were tucked away in cupboards, some unopened, some eaten, but all forever changed in memory. A letter from Hazelworth. Miss Marple received a small letter one morning, written in a neat but unfamiliar hand. It was from Martha Finch, now restored to dignity and peace. Dear Miss Marple, we shall never be able to thank you enough. Without your calm wisdom, my name would have been forever stained. I have put away my jam pans, but I have taken up my knitting again, and I find it brings a quieter contentment. Yours most sincerely, Martha. Miss Marple folded the letter, her eyes thoughtful. She placed it beside her teacup, where the light caught the ink, and mused that one never knew which humble vessel, a teacup, a jam jar, or even a page of writing, might hold life, death, or truth. An evening by the fire. That evening she sat by her fire in St. Mary Mead, her knitting needles flashing softly in the glow. Mrs. Bantry had dropped in for a chat, and the two ladies spoke of gardens, servants, and small village troubles. Yet behind Miss Marple's serene smile lay her unshakable awareness. "Jane," said Mrs. Bantry suddenly, "don't you ever tire of it? These dreadful things you notice beneath the ordinary?" Miss Marple's expression softened. "My dear, one must notice, for it is in the noticing that harm may sometimes be prevented. People put their malice into the smallest of things. A spoonful of sugar, a drop of ink, a jar of jam. And yet," she added with a little sigh, "people also put their kindness there too." Closing reflection. Outside, the church bells tolled the hour. The village lay wrapped in quiet, its cottages glowing warm against the cold. Life would go on in Hazelworth, with its quarrels and fates, its gardens and gossip. But the memory of the poisoned jam jar would remain, tucked into the village's collective cupboard of stories, to be taken down and whispered over in years to come. And Miss Marple, knitting serenely, knew she would be ready for whatever pattern of human folly came next. Chapter 13. Echoes in Hazelworth winter softened the village lanes beneath a powdering of snow. Children's laughter returned, ringing across the green, and the parish ladies busied themselves with carols and parcels for the poor. Outwardly, Hazelworth was once again the picture of English tranquillity, yet beneath the cheer, whispers remained. The Blue Boar remembers, at the Blue Boar tea-room, the jam jar was still spoken of in lowered voices. "Do you recall how it began?" Mrs. Perkins asked one afternoon. Mrs. Carmody replied briskly, "I recall very well, and I recall who nearly let poor Martha Finch be ruined." Each repetition of the story was a little altered, embroidered with new flourishes, a different colour of ribbon on the jar, a fresh emphasis on who had really suspected whom. In this way the crime grew into a kind of folklore, half truth and half invention, yet always carrying its shadow. Clara's visit, Clara Dawes, who had once been so near to scandal, came to call on Miss Marple during the Christmas season. She carried a small gift, a jar of damson preserve, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "I hesitated to bring it, Miss Marple," she admitted with a nervous laugh. "But I thought it might be time to prove jam can still be sweet." Miss Marple smiled gently as she accepted it. "My dear, it is not the jam we must mistrust, but the people who stir the pot." Miss Marple reflects. Later, as she set the damson jar upon her pantry shelf, Miss Marple paused. The sight of its neat label and dark fruit within reminded her of how pride and resentment had soured another jar not so very long ago. She reflected that villagers never truly forget such things. They simply weave them into their tapestry of memory, where they sit alongside tales of love, harvests, and fêtes. In the quiet of her cottage, she resumed her knitting, her needles clicking like a steady clock. She knew that, just as surely as seasons turned, another mystery would one day come knocking at the door of St. Mary Mead. Chapter 14. The Quiet Cupboard. The snow had melted into soft drifts of mud along the lanes, and the churchyard crocuses pushed their pale heads through the earth. In Hazelworth life appeared unchanged. The shop bell tinkled, the postman whistled, and children ran to school. Yet the shadow of the poison jam jar lingered, as faint as the smell of preserves clinging to an old pantry shelf. A cupboard of memories in the Finch cottage. Martha at last opened her pantry door without trembling. Rows of jars gleamed, raspberry, gooseberry, and plum. All innocent, all harmless. She had thought once to give up jam-making forever, but Miss Marple's letter had encouraged her otherwise. It is never the jar, my dear, but the hand that fills it. Those words had steadied her more than any doctor's tonic. In St. Mary Mead, back in her own village, Miss Marple sat with Mrs. Bantry beside a cheerful fire. They spoke of ordinary matters, a new maid in service, a neighbour's ill-fitting curtains, the vicar's latest sermon. Yet Mrs. Bantry could not resist one question. "Jane," she asked, "do you ever think of it, the jam jar?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her hands did not pause in their knitting. "My dear, I think of it as I think of most things.
A useful reminder.
Sweetness and danger can be found together in the most ordinary of cupboards." The last reflection, when Mrs. Bantry departed, Miss Marple rose and looked out upon her little garden. The winter air was sharp, and in the fading light she could see the first snowdrops rising from the soil, delicate, white, and pure. Yet she knew that beneath the frost weeds too were stirring. With a sigh both tender and knowing, she murmured, "Human nature, like jam, always keeps its flavour, whether sweet or bitter." She drew her shawl about her shoulders, returned to her chair, and let her needles click softly into the evening, as steady as the passing of time itself. Chapter 15. The Village Forgets. Spring crept quietly into Hazelworth. The hedgerows turned green again, the swallows returned to the church eaves, and the villagers, as they always did, moved on. A new fête be May. Plans for the next summer fête were in full swing. This year it was decided there would be no jam competition. "Best left alone," Mrs. Carmody declared with unusual solemnity. Instead, the Women's Institute arranged a display of embroidery and a prize for the finest sponge cake. Yet, even as they discussed patterns and recipes, there was always a sly glance, a whispered aside, "Do you remember the jam?" Gossip Wayne's children, who had once been hushed when passing Martha Finch's cottage, now ran past merrily, carrying marbles and skipping ropes. To them, the story of the poison jar was already becoming a tale, something overheard from adults, a fragment of village legend. Martha herself went about with quiet dignity, never boasting, never reminding anyone of her ordeal. She had taken Miss Marple's advice and filled her shelves again with preserves, though she no longer entered them for competition. Miss Marple's visit one afternoon, Miss Marple came by train to Hazelworth. She called on Martha and shared tea with her in the little kitchen. The shelves behind them shone with fresh glass jars, sunlight glinting off their neat labels. "It pleases me," Miss Marple said softly, "to see the cupboard full again."
A village remembers scandal, yes, but it also forgets. Time and kindness do their work like yeast in a good loaf. Martha's eyes misted. I don't think I'll ever forget what you did, Miss Marple.
"You saw what no one else did," Miss Marple smiled. "Oh, my dear, I only noticed what was always there. It is the little things that tell us the truth." The last word, when she returned to St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple resumed her ordinary routine. Church, her garden, her knitting, yet every so often as she spooned jam onto her toast, she would pause and reflect that even sweetness could be soured by pride, fear, or envy, and then, with her usual calmness, she would take a sip of tea and knit on, watching for the next small ripple in human nature that might one day swell into another storm. Chapter 16. The Empty Jar. The garden at St. Mary Mead was drowsy in late summer. Bees hummed lazily over lavender, the roses flushed pink in the warmth, and Miss Marple sat by her small table with tea, toast, and a pot of homemade blackcurrant jam. A quiet afternoon, Mrs. Bantry had just departed, full of cheerful chatter about her nephew's new motor car. The garden was peaceful again, and the knitting needles clicked steadily in Miss Marple's hands. Yet her eyes strayed now and then to the jam pot beside her plate. She lifted it, peering into its glossy depths, and smiled faintly. The jar was nearly empty. A curious thing, she reflected, how quickly something sweet could vanish, leaving only the traces at the edges, a thought on human nature. She considered Hazelworth, already turning its gossip to other things. A new curate, a scandal about hens in a neighbour's garden, the never-ending talk of recipes. The poisoned jam jar, once the terror of the village, was now almost forgotten.
Almost, but not quite. Forgetting, Miss Marple murmured, is often a kindness.
But human nature.
Oh, it never forgets entirely.
Pride, envy, fear, they are always there, waiting like dust at the bottom of a cupboard. The closing image. She spooned the last of the jam onto her toast and spread it carefully. Then she set the empty jar on the sill where the sunlight caught the faint red gleam inside the glass. For a moment it glowed, a harmless relic, yet a reminder too. Ordinary things, Miss Marple thought, were never truly ordinary. With that, she folded her knitting, reached for her tea, and smiled gently to herself. The garden was still, the air golden with late light, and though no danger lurked at that moment, she knew well enough that another little ripple in village life would come soon, and she would be there, quiet, watchful, ready. Chapter 17. The Last Crust of Bread. An ordinary supper. It was a quiet evening in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat at her neat little table, a pot of tea, steaming bread cut into tidy slices, and a small dish of butter beside her. The pantry shelves were stocked again with preserves, raspberry, gooseberry, plum, each jar neatly labelled in her careful hand. She spread a modest spoonful of jam onto a slice of bread and paused, her eyes lingering on the deep colour. So innocent, so homely, and yet she knew better than anyone how such sweetness could mask bitterness and danger. Memories in the firelight. The fire crackled gently in the hearth, and as she ate, Miss Marple let her thoughts drift back to Hazelworth. Martha Finch's grateful smile, Inspector Graves's reluctant nod of respect, the hush that had fallen when Mrs. Dawes confessed. All of it was already slipping into the shadows of memory. The villagers would talk of it for years, of course, but always a little less precisely, a little more like a tale told over supper. In time, the poisoned jam jar would become almost a legend, a reflection on human nature. Miss Marple laid down her cup and folded her hands.
People are very like jam, she thought.
Sweetness on the outside, yet sometimes with a seed of sharpness within.
And left too long, even the best can turn. She smiled, not sadly, but with her usual quiet acceptance.
Human nature would always provide its puzzles, some tragic, some foolish, all endlessly revealing. The last word, she rose, tidied the table, and set the empty plate neatly on the dresser. As she passed the window, the church bell tolled the hour, solemn and steady, carrying across the twilight. Miss Marple drew her shawl around her shoulders, picked up her knitting, and settled back by the fire. The needles clicked softly, a rhythm as timeless as the gossip of villages and the secrets of human heart. And outside, the summer dusk deepened, serene on the surface, yet holding within it, as always, the quiet promise of another mystery yet to come. Chapter 18. The Preserves of Memory. Autumn in St. Mary. Mead, the season had turned. The hedgerows were heavy with blackberries, the lanes lined with crisp golden leaves. In her garden, Miss Marple moved slowly among the last roses, trimming here, tying there, her hands deft and certain despite their age. In her kitchen, the scent of stewing fruit lingered. Jars of fresh blackberry and apple preserve lined the shelves, glowing like jewels in the fading afternoon light, a gift from Hazelworth. That morning, a small parcel had arrived by post. Inside was a jar of strawberry jam, its label written in a careful, grateful hand. "With fond thanks, Martha Finch." Miss Marple held it up to the light. The colour was rich and wholesome, no trace of bitterness, no shadow of fear. She smiled gently, touched by the gesture, though she knew the villagers of Hazelworth would never quite forget the jam jar that had once brought death. A quiet philosophy, sitting down by the fire. Miss Marple thought to herself, people are very quick to forget, yet what is forgotten is never truly gone. The past preserves itself in memory, like jam in a jar, sometimes sweet, sometimes sour, always with its seeds intact. She poured her tea, spread the fresh jam on bread, and ate with quiet satisfaction. The timeless watcher outside. The church bells tolled the hour, their sound carrying across the village roofs into the lengthening dusk. Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting and gazed into the fire. Another case was over, another shadow dispelled. Yet she knew, as surely as she knew the seasons would turn, that pride, envy, and folly would bloom again.
In Hazelworth, in St. Mary Mead, and beyond. And when they did,
she would be ready, calm, patient, observant. For mysteries, like jam, had a way of reappearing when least expected. Chapter 19. The Last Spoon of Sugar. A winter morning, snow lay crisp across St. Mary Mead, softening the cottages and fields into a picture postcard calm. Miss Marple's parlour was bright with winter sun, and her table was set simply, a steaming teapot, a small plate of seed cake, and one jar of damson preserve she had saved from autumn. The world seemed peaceful, untroubled, as if murder and scandal could never enter here. Yet Miss Marple, with her usual mild expression, knew better. A visitor with gossip Mrs. Bantry dropped in, red-cheeked from the cold. She settled by the fire with her usual brisk chatter, speaking of church bazaars, of the vicar's new sermon,
and inevitably of Hazelworth. They still talk of it, she confided,
lowering her voice as though the very jam jars on Miss Marple's shelf might overhear. Though you know how it is, the story grows round the edges like mould. Already they say poor Mr. Enderby collapsed after 3 spoonfuls instead of 1. Miss Marple smiled. Yes, dear. Memory always sweetens or sours with time. It is very seldom exact. A lesson in the ordinary as Mrs. Bantry reached for a slice of cake. Miss Marple carefully buttered her bread, spread a modest layer of jam, and said softly, "It is the most ordinary things that conceal the sharpest truths. A glove, a handkerchief, a jar of jam, and people, like preserves, cannot always hide what they truly are."
A little crack in the jar and all is revealed. Mrs. Bantry looked faintly puzzled.
But Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she sipped her tea. The final note. When her guest had gone, Miss Marple tidied away the dishes and paused at the window. Children were throwing snowballs in the lane, their laughter ringing through the frosty air. She thought of Hazelworth, of Martha Finch's jar sent in gratitude, of how easily kindness can be forgotten and pride remembered. Yet she felt no melancholy. The world was as it had always been, full of sweetness, touched with bitterness, endlessly repeating itself. Miss Marple returned to her chair, knitting once more in the stillness. The snow fell softly, and the last spoon of sugar in her cup melted away, leaving behind only the flavour, as all things do. Chapter 20. The Quiet Hearth. The evening glow. It was late February in St. Mary Mead. The evenings stretched a little longer now, though the air was still sharp with frost. Miss Marple sat in her parlour by the fire, her knitting needles moving with steady patience. The shelves of jam set neatly in her pantry gleamed faintly in the firelight whenever the door was opened. Rows of simple preserves, nothing more. Nothing less a letter, remembered. On the small table beside her lay a letter from Hazelworth. Martha Finch had written again, her words full of warmth and gratitude. "I have begun to teach the village children to make jam, Miss Marple, so that what once brought bitterness might bring sweetness again." Miss Marple read the lines twice, then folded the letter carefully. She murmured to herself, "Yes, people are very good at beginning anew, though, alas, they are just as quick at repeating the same follies." A visitor at dusk, the vicar's wife, dropped by with a basket of scones, speaking cheerfully of small village matters, a wedding to come, a squabble over allotments, a young girl caught borrowing ribbon without leave. Small things to anyone else. Yet Miss Marple listened as if they were threads in a tapestry, smiling gently at the pattern she saw forming. The last reflection. When her guest had gone, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gazed into the glowing embers. Murder by jam jar was past now, yet the lesson remained, as all such lessons do. Life, she thought, is rather like a pantry of preserves. Some jars are sweet, some sharp, some made with care, others spoiled by neglect, and one must always test the lid, for it is in the smallest crack that corruption begins. Her expression softened. She poured herself one last cup of tea, added a spoon of sugar, and sipped it slowly. Outside the church bell tolled, steady and familiar. The fire burned low. The evening deepened, and Miss Marple, ever watchful, sat quietly in her chair, content to wait for the next pattern that human nature would inevitably provide.